a guy who transformed thunder, blood, and fire into the everlasting pulse of rock. Gene Simmons is the fire-breathing monster of Kiss and the everlasting face of rock and roll all night. He is the towering figure who established an empire in addition to a band. From smoke-filled bars to stadiums devoured by flames of light, this warrior carried the banner of defiance on every battlefield. He represents perseverance and resilience to countless others, going beyond his role as a musician. In the midst of unending anarchy, a structure made of iron will be beaten and rebuilt. But storms have carved out a life beneath that fiery mask, damaging wounds that would be drowned out by the ear-splitting roar of 1,000 arenas. A heavier, fiercer, and more cruel storm comes, throwing a shadow over the final act of a man the world once believed unbreakable, at the age of 76, just when dusk should have brought serenity. Should Gene Simmons have ever placed her heart on you, please press like in honor of an icon who bears the weight of immortal fame and the agony that has never fully healed. Imagining evenings when there was no one at the table breaks my heart. A coat sewn from a discarded army blanket and walls so thin they could not seal out the wind were the sole sources of warmth and comfort when hunger became one's only companion and cold crept in like an enemy that never left. With the exception of a child's muted cries as his mother toiled herself to weariness, the interior of those walls was devoid of sound. The world will eventually recognize that infant as Gene Simmons. He was born Kame Witz on August 25, 1949. Flora, his mother, had miraculously survived the concentration camps when she was a teenager. Nevertheless, she did so in quiet, bearing wounds that words could never heal. Her sobs would sometimes burst forth out of nowhere. Her guardian angel may be stifling at times. Nevertheless, beneath it all there was a love that had been burned, a devotion that had been nourished by the anguish and the will to survive. His protector, he would refer to her as his moral compass and anchor. She was the one constant truth in a world full of chaos. Regardless, storms occurred. Despair and poverty split Gene's family when he was just 6 years old. His father remarried and disappeared from his son's life permanently after he couldn't bear the burden of struggle any longer. Everything has been silent. Letters, visits, voices, and more, a wound that bled ceaselessly. Being an only child meant that Gene had to take on the heavy responsibility of being the breadwinner before he was emotionally prepared. Their perpetual specter was poverty. On many occasions, no food was offered. His mother worked 15-hour days in factories, sewing buttons until they bled, and then came home to another night of loneliness and exhaustion. They lived in tented apartments, never sure if they could stay, and they were constantly on the verge of being swallowed by the streets as rent loomed like a monster at the door. To chip in, little Gene would collect fruit from the roadside and sell it. She quickly learned that hard work was required to earn even a small amount of money. With nothing more than a coat fashioned from a discarded blanket, he was vulnerable to the biting cold of winter, the agony of shoes that were so old that they hardly fit, and most of all the agony of being alone as he sobbed himself to sleep in a room that was deserted night after night. There was no safety at school. Everything about him, his accent, his foreignness, his uniqueness, made him an easy target for harshness. It was as if every single classroom was a battleground. All the whispers behind his back were sharp as knives. After every chuckle he was unable to evade the verdict. Unfortunately, animosity persisted even in the ostensibly safe haven. Despite all, he found a hidden entrance amidst the agony: books on comics, Superman, Spider-Man, and other characters with superhuman strength. He relied on them for survival. He did more than only peruse them. As though every hero in the book were rescuing him from the impending doom, he clutched onto them. To begin with, he was illiterate. Still, his fingers quivered as he desperately tried to decipher the words. He taught himself, slowly and painfully. His determination to master the language of heroes led him to juggle Hebrew, Hungarian, Turkish, and now English at the age of 7. Not a single frame or page provided amusement. Egress was the goal, an act of rebellion, a glimmer of optimism. Gathering her remaining strength, Flora clutched her son's hand as 1957 drew to a close. They got on a ship bound for America. They were just two immigrants venturing into the unknown in Queens, New York, equipped only with each other and the determination to live. They had no father to welcome them, No relatives to provide refuge, no knowledge of the English language, and no money on hand. From the depths of despair, that boy who had been wounded by starvation, abandonment, and the hushed sorrow of a mother's troubled past would emerge as the fire-breathing demon known as John Simmons. A child who would not be destroyed by the storm stood alone before the fire. He changed his name from Chaim Witz to Eugene John Clenny when he was 8 years old. The initial futile endeavor to heal the wounds of his history and forge an improbable path forward. However, the brutality persisted even after being renamed. People made fun of his accent. Stares were drawn by his used clothing. He was labeled as peculiar by his silence. He was too much for the Jewish school to handle. He was already hurt by the public school system. Every classroom turned become a platform for shame. With each chuckle from his fellow students, he is reminded. A world that would not accept him made him feel like an outsider. Gene still knew that giving up was not an option, even at that early stage. Selling cactus plants door to door for pennies was his profession. He did whatever was necessary to make ends meet, including standing behind deli counters and butcher shops chopping meat. With every penny he hoarded, he fought against the childhood hunger that had plagued him. John, in contrast to his peers, held to lucidity, believing that his mind was his sole weapon for escaping the darkness, while others masked their anguish with smoke and booze. Later on, under the dim light of a fading television and the weathered pages of using comic books as a tool, he battled to educate himself English. Our heroes, like Superman and Spider-Man, are monumental. He clutched to them tightly, as if they were lifelines. They proved that strength could be derived from suffering. After then, February 9, 1964 arrived. The Fab Four made an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. The world was suddenly rocked by the sound of 4 young men strumming guitars. John sat engrossed, his heart racing, in the face of an unforgettable reality. Sure, give it to me, becoming somebody is my goal. At the age of 19, he was passing himself off as a 6th-grade teacher in Spanish Harlem while making $75 per week. On the inside, though, a maelstrom of music raged that he could do nothing to quiet. At that moment, he met Paul Stanley, a soulmate who shared his desire for a more significant, audible, and memorable experience. Rainbow was born out of their collaboration, and Wicked Lester was born out of that. Jimi Hendrix himself constructed the hallowed Electric Lady Studios in 1972, and it was there that they recorded an album that year. Gene had anticipated it as the starting point. The record never even got a chance to breathe because execs wrote it off as too weird and chaotic. Destroyed his heart, his effort, and his dream. After Kiss had ruled the globe for a while, Gene would have to pay the price. The cost to get those original tapes is $138,000. Not to liberate them, but to keep them buried forever. Evidence that anyone, no matter how powerful, might be haunted by failure. But he made fire from that wreckage. There was never a wall when it came to failure, he would later add. That was kindling. Finally, Gene and Paul were married at the age of 24. Risked it all on a single gamble. Along with guitarist Ace Frehley and drummer Peter Criss, they formed a band that the world had never witnessed before. Kiss, just 12 people, mostly girlfriends, showed up to their debut performance at the cramped Queens Club, the Coventry. But by that point, Gene had fully immersed himself in his fate. He imbued the demon, a monster straight out of nightmares, comic novels, and the darkest corners of literature, with wings like bats, spat blood, breathed fire, and brought him to life. In the recesses of his mind, they lacked radio blockbusters, MTV slots, and chart-topping songs, but they possessed something far more dangerous: spectacle, word of mouth. Years later, he would admit, the demon was everything I could never be as a boy. Fearless, untouchable, unforgettable, and unforgettable it was. Word got out, not through the airwaves, but through rumors of on-stage mayhem and fire. In just 2 years, they had gone from sold-out clubs to raucous stadiums. Then in 1975, Alive went boom, capturing the craziness of their concerts, the screaming, the fire, the thunder, and selling millions. It saved their record label from bankruptcy and made Kiss immortal. In the mid-1970s, Kiss had evolved from a band into a phenomenon, and Gene Simmons, the once hungry boy who sobbed alone in a dark room, had gone from starving to a raging inferno. The world could no longer turn its head away from the roar of fire, the crash of drums, and the thunder of guitars. As Bob Ezrin shaped Destroyer into a near symphony, theatrics, choirs, and strings were sewn into thunderous riffs. The lights became dazzling, the crowd swelled, and the makeup became mythical. However, beneath the surface of the myth, there were cracks appearing. Ezrin demanded obedience, rewrote songs, reshaped their sound, and bruised egos along the way. Gene felt the music was. At the end of the decade, spectacle reached a fever pitch. The Dynasty Tour transformed arenas into war zones of fire and steel. Gene spit flames into the roar of thousands as he flew above the stage, but beneath that roar came silence. The studio felt like a battlefield where every note spilled trust. A disco-laced album brought radio play, but the rebellion that had made them legends was fading. Families filled seats once owned by fanatics. Arenas that once thundered began to echo with emptiness. Downsized shows, cancellations, and shadows spreading across the empire were also factors. Deards, the ones who had bled with the band, were leaving. Seats. For the first time, the demon felt his kingdom shake. On the inside, the chaos was even worse. Peter Criss's addiction spiraled out of control, causing his shows to collapse under his wrath. He would sometimes sabotage their music by lash out, or even stop mid-song. Gann would describe it as self-destruction, a cancer that devoured the foundation we had worked so hard to build. The fire enchanted the audience on stage, but it ate them alive behind the scenes. Next came humiliation. In an effort to broaden their audience, Kiss collaborated with Hanna-Barbera, Scooby-Doo on Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. However, this collaboration transformed the gods of thunder into cartoon clowns, leaving fans feeling betrayed. Critics found this amusing, and the band tried to put it out of their minds. Gene enjoyed the spotlight, but he was aware that his mask had cracked. "I was under the impression that we might be superheroes," he admitted years later. However, we ended up laughing at ourselves. Their egos clashed, admirers scattered, and the brotherhood that had been built on fire started to crumble by the turn of the 80s, when their pictures were emblazoned on lunchboxes and toys. Their celebrity was ubiquitous, but it came at a great price. The monster still lingered, roared, but Gene was still confused about whether his fire was leading or destroying everything. Following Peter's demon consumption, Eric Carr, the Fox, took over. Eric's thunder gave Kiss a second wind, but the question remained, had they become too strange, too distant from the hunger that had once built them? In response, Gene and Paul made their most daring gamble in the early 80s, removing the war paint that had made them gods before millions. Lick It Up achieved platinum sales, demonstrating that the risk had paid off. Gene subsequently stated, "Taking off the makeup was survival. The world finally got a glimpse of their features after a decade of hiding. Our true selves were revealed, we were unstoppable." However, the storms persisted in their relentless pace. New idols, faster music, and harder riffs were the hallmarks of the rock era. Embraced fads, softer turns, glam, power ballads, receiving both acclaim and criticism. Fans argued about whether the band had lost its essence, and seats were vacant. As Gene confessed, "We were chasing trends, and sometimes the trends chased us." However, the machine continued to roar night after night, proving that it was still going strong. Gann's influence extended beyond the stage. He was cast as villains and Runaway by Hollywood, and others brought the demon to the big screen. Rumors began to circulate though, and soon enough, Gene was leaving Paul to keep Kiss alive. Meanwhile, tensions within the band were rising, stemming from issues of identity and money. Were they still Kiss, or were they just? Then came the reunion that no one had ever imagined. In the mid-1990s, Gene, Paul, Ace and Peter made a triumphant return, their faces painted as if gods had risen again. They played 92 shows in 75 cities, sold over 1 million tickets, earned $143 million, stadiums trembled, generations sobbed, and thunder roared again. However, beneath their painted smiles, old wounds bled again. Ace and Peter were paid flat rates, $80,000 per night, while Gene and Paul took home the majority. Disputes ensued, animosity flared up again, and the Brotherhood of Fire became a battleground once again. Gene Simmons saw these 20 years as a time of rebirth and reckoning. He revealed his true identity, dominated new charts, made a grand entrance into Hollywood, and guided Kiss to their most lucrative tour ever. However, with every victory came setback. Gene Simmons stood unbreakable through all of it. The demon could fall, bleed, and even burn, but he always got back up. And by getting back up, he proved that survival is more than just victory, it's the purest form of glory. On stage, Gene Simmons was unstoppable, the demon of rock. He had to deal with shadows, changing styles, creative wars, legal battles, and the endless weight of trying to keep an empire alive while the world tried to tear it apart. In 1979, amidst Kiss's stadium dominance and Gene's ubiquitous lunchbox stardom, he embarked on a seemingly impossible romance with Cher, a goddess of pop who had weathered storms and reinvented herself multiple times. To the outside world, they were diametrically opposed figures, she, beautiful and glamorous, and he, the fire-breathing demon. However, they managed to find a delicate equilibrium when they were together. Gene later confessed that with Cher, he found stability, a serenity he had never experienced, as if her presence muted the clamor of fame. Cher also hinted in later years that Gene made her laugh when life got tough, and that behind her mask she saw a man yearning for peace. Unfortunately, the spark that had united them soon set fire to everything in its path. Gene's affections shifted to Diana Ross, who was Cher's closest friend, and a woman bound to her by more than just their friendship. Not only was she betrayed by the man she trusted, but she was also hurt by the friend she considered family. Years later, she confessed that the pain still lingered, and the story became one of the most notorious betrayals in Hollywood. The public saw it as a scandal, but sharing it was devastating. In the end, the unbreakable bond between the two women crumbled under the weight of one man's desire, and for Gene, it was more than just gossip. Diana, on the other hand, carried her own shadows of guilt. Loving Gene was like embracing fire, but hurting Cher was like carrying an eternal weight. It was a chip in his honor. On stage, he controlled fire. Off stage, it ate him alive. The press painted him as a villain, and his once loathed admirers now spoke of him with disdain. "I thought I was chasing love, but I was really running from myself," he would later admit. He carried the embarrassment of the headlines, and the nagging feeling that he had caused hurt that no amount of praise could ever alleviate as a result of that scandal. Underneath it all, among the rubble, he found an unalterable truth, that not even the roar of adoration or a mountain of money could protect him from the fallout of his own insidiously passionate fears. By breaking Cher's heart, he wounded a woman admired for her strength. By turning to Diana, he severed a sisterhood that the world had believed would last forever. Despite the scandal, he remained unburned. It marked him with the silent burden of guilt. Looking back, Gene could see the source clearly, a fear of permanence, raised by a mother preoccupied with survival and abandoned by a father who vanished. He had spent his life escaping from hunger, silence, and love. With Cher, he had experienced the potential of love, but with Diana, he lost sight of the loyalty that love demands. Fame gave him fire, but it also gave him excuses to run, from love, from permanence, and from himself. No one bore the cost of that running more than Shannon Tweed. The demon who had seemed immortal on stage discovered the crux of it all, that in love, armor is not there, and that even legends can fall without trust. Some scars, however, remain long after the music fades. Unforgiving light of reality TV, a single image burned into the minds of countless viewers. Shannon Tweed, who had been by Gene Simmons' side for nearly 3 decades, tossed a stack of Polaroid photos into the fire. Not mementos, but ghosts. Thousands of frozen expressions from a life lived at a breakneck pace. Evidence of a man who had spent years outrunning persistence.
While on stage, the demon's fiery breath astonished the world. At home, it consumed his once hidden secrets, leaving him bereft of spectacle. What Shannon experienced was not spectacle, but rather the visible manifestation of her heartbreak, the weary wail of a woman who had endured the silent weight of betrayal for an excessive amount of time. As for Jean, it was shame, but it was also a reflection. The legendary figure who controlled arenas had never before been made to see the destruction through the eyes of the one who never left. Flashback to 1983, when Shannon became a constant in Jean's life, not a flit, but a flame, strong and delicate, graceful under pressure, with sharp humor and a grounded presence. With her, Jean discovered something no arena could provide. In the stillness of the night, with laughter resonating through empty kitchens, they created a home where the demon's armor could be finally shed. They shared moments that seemed almost mundane, on purpose. Their son Nick was born in 1989, and their daughter Sophie was born in 1992. Jean, who had never had a father figure in her life, found fatherhood to be a revelation. He almost couldn't believe it, but the sound of his children's laughter filled the air with more joy than any concert. Meanwhile, Shannon carried the unspoken burden of trying to build a family while haunted by a promise that never materialized. The joy of celebrating holidays and birthdays was accompanied by a twinge of sadness, love without acknowledgement, devotion without permanence. The passage of time did little to alleviate the pain. Shannon started to talk about the unthinkable on national television, her voice steady but her eyes fatigued, confessing that she felt invisible and that devotion without commitment was gradually destroying her spirit. Fans sobbed with her while critics made fun of Jean. The wait of 28 years is long, even for the strongest hearts. But the truth went deeper than rumors. Here was a woman drained by doubt, and a man who confused freedom with fear. Jean's boasts of thousands of victories were not strength, but armor. Beneath the bluster was a boy who had learned early on that love could disappear overnight, raised by a mother who had lost too much. His life became a series of broken promises, which Shannon took as a personal attack. The public witnessed the escalating tensions as a photo of Jean smiling beside models on the red carpet sparked arguments that escalated into therapy sessions, all while millions watched. It was no longer an intimate struggle. The counseling couch had become a stage without fire, makeup, or escape. He said he wasn't made for marriage, while she complained about being bored of making a life for two. He maintained his love for his family, while she questioned why love never came with a ring. Millions watched, but it didn't matter. That act wasn't for them, it was for her. Then the fire broke out. The Polaroids, those mementos of a troubled past, went up in smoke, tiny but heavy. The sound of each photo's curling into ash was louder than a drumbeat. Paper can't erase betrayal, but it can mark the beginning and the end. In that fire, Shannon wasn't erasing history, she was reclaiming her life. And Jean, standing there without pretense, realized that the demon couldn't stand a chance against the quiet fury of a woman demanding truth. Jean finally stopped running in 2011, when she was 62 years old, and stood before Shannon Tweed, making the vow she had waited 28 years to hear. The wedding that they shared with the world was far from a fairy tale. Too many wounds had been inflicted, and too many heroes had been slain. Instead, it was a rarer kind of reckoning, the moment when a man who had insisted he didn't need anyone finally conceded that love was the one fire worth preserving. Unfortunately for Shannon, it wasn't the balm that had soothed generations of pain. In retrospect, Jean acknowledged the vows did not resolve the family's history, but they did establish a new language, a language of trust. And for Shin, it was a surrender. For their children, it was hope. Nick recounted the relief of finally feeling the tension melt away, and Sophie spoke of the relief of finally having her parents choose the same future, truth that he had long masked with bluster. His reluctance to commit had never been due to hubris, but rather to a deep-seated fear. I believed I was shielding myself, he whispered, but in reality, I was fleeing the one thing that truly mattered to me. The young man who had grown up without a father had become a man utterly terrified of permanence, and he had fled before he could be abandoned. He learnt the hardest truth from Shannon: strength is not in conquering, but in remaining loyal. It is not in running away, but in staying. Shannon, on the other hand, never portrayed herself as a saint. She referred to her struggle as endurance, and she taught others the hard way that love is not magic, but rather the daily fight for trust. Gene Simmons fought the longest and most punishing battle of his life in the storm of his heart. On stage, the demon appeared unstoppable, spitting fire to the thunderous applause of millions. However, in the comfort of his own home, he came to terms with a harsher reality. While fire may captivate for a moment, loyalty is the truest way to keep a house warm for all time. His relationship with Shannon is a tale of redemption and scars. It serves as a constant reminder that even demons must submit to love, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is not to breathe fire, but rather to quietly and faithfully keep a flame alive day after day. After all, fame is just noise, but love is the ultimate signal. After the vows of 2011, it seemed like the story of Gene Simmons had finally come to a close. After decades of running, he had finally chosen love. But as the new millennium began, Gene faced battles not with fire and guitars, but with his own reflection, struggles of fatherhood, and the power of silence turned into song. Even legends are reminded that storms never truly end. Artistry, legacy itself. In boardrooms and on stages, he still appeared unbeatable. From demon to king of branding, he designed an empire immortalized on t-shirts, action figures, and even coffins. From the outside looking in, he seemed like the ultimate winner, a man who had transformed makeup and spectacle into power, myth, and money. However, beneath the surface of the empire's radiance, dark clouds gathered. The focus was not on the demon, but on the father, the artist, the man. Gene felt the first stab of hurt when, in the late 2000s, his son Nick was accused of stealing plot points from the Japanese manga, Bleach, to use in his own comic. The tabloids feasted on this scandal, but the accusation that cut deeper was the suggestion that Gene had failed as a father. The man who had built an empire could not even guide his own son, and critics said that he was a demon who could sell anything except fatherhood. The criticism was too much for Gene, who had sworn he would never let his children feel the absence of a father figure in his own life, and it was more than just scandalous, it was shameful, as it reflected his own childhood wounds, and resurfaced through his son. His art took a beating as his family name was tarnished. By the turn of the millennium, Kiss had become the most merchandised band in history. With each tour came new products, and with each logo stamped on another item. Gan saw it as a vision to immortalize the band beyond music, but many saw it as a desecration. Critics questioned why Kiss would sell everything but their souls. The band, once feared as dangerous, had become, in their view, a cartoon.
Becoming a salesman was a humiliation that not even applause could wash away for Gene, a man whose entire life had been defined by defiance and rebellion. Then, in 2017, Gene tried to trademark the iconic devil horns hand gesture, which he perceived as a way to protect rock's property, but which the world interpreted as a sign of arrogance. The reaction was swift and vicious, and he withdrew the trademark within days, but the wounds remained. The demon who once breathed fire now found himself walking through a hailstorm of doubt, with every step measured and every word scrutinized. Yet Gan never bowed. Publicly, he stood tall, unflinching in interviews, sharp in defense, unwilling to show weakness. But privately, the burden grew heavier as he was branded as grasping and opportunistic by the media. Add to that a series of legal accusations, most of which were settled quietly, but each left its bruise, and the image of invincibility cracked again. "If anything works, I don't apologize." He said that once, a more brutal reality was now staring him in the face. No amount of praise can buy respect, and whether you're a father or an artist, it's far easier to lose respect than to earn it again. Gene Simmons did not consider this a marketing ploy or a theatrical trick. It was the man's reckoning with the fact that although the mask may win over people, only he can face the mirror. No amount of corporate turmoil, scandal headlines, or fame-induced clamor could compare to the relative quiet that descended upon the world in 2018. It was the stillness that accompanies grief, the stillness that may weaken the will of heroes. Gene Simmons, the rock god, mogul, and mask, was suddenly invisible to the world. As he bid farewell to the woman he had referred to as his moral compass, the one light that had accompanied him through all the darkness, all they could see was a broken, quivering sun. His mother, Flora Clenny, was more than that. She had been a teenager throughout the Holocaust, and she was the only survivor. She worked in sweatshops so her son could have food. Despite bearing indescribable anguish, the shield never allowed it to affect him. Jean kept quiet about her for a long time. When he did speak, though it was with an air of respect. "I look up to my mom. I inherited all my strength from her." Word got out that she had left, and it was as if someone had stomped on his foundation. Jean has always played the role of the heroic stage performer, an individual who exhaled flames with an air of invincibility. At Flora's funeral, however, there was a pall of quiet, only broken by the sound of the tears shed by a son who lost the ability to contact his mother at the darkest hours of the night, and who no longer had her voice to guide him in matters of morality. His devoted fan base, which had been following him for decades, now got a glimpse of the youngster who had suffered a devastating loss and stood in the shadow of his unfaltering affection. During interviews, he removed his mask entirely. "I've lost my greatest teacher," he said, his voice filled with guilt. "Not with words, but by her own example, she taught me everything." The demon could lash out at the world, but he couldn't fight the stillness of a phone that would never ring again. Shannon, Nick, and Sophie stood by his side, but they too felt the burden of absence. To them, Flora had been more than just a number. She was a symbol of survival, dignity, and love for Jean, who had built an empire on defiance and spectacle. This grief was unique. It was raw, unmasked, and inescapable, beyond a grandmother. She was the linchpin of strength, the evidence that it was possible to survive, and the silent narrator of their family's history. Seeing Gan, the unwavering fighter, crumble in her absence, made them understand what millions of others had noticed. Legends, too, succumbed to loss. However, even in his anguish, Jean sought to pay tribute to her in the only way he knew how. "I am because she was," he said simply, his voice free of demon but bearing the truth of a son speaking the most profound words he had ever spoken. For Gene Simmons, 2018 was more than just the year he lost his mother. It was the year the illusion crumbled, a constant reminder that behind every victory there is frequently a silent sacrifice. Gene Simmons appeared unstoppable for decades, a towering force who spit fire and thundered across the world's greatest stages. Flora's passing did not diminish the fire he breathed on stage, but it opened the truth behind it, that every flame begins with love. And when that love is gone, no amount of volume can ever make up for it. But this year, it wasn't an opponent or the clamor of detractors that dealt the fatal blow, it was his own body. A searing pain engulfed him, sharp and unrelenting, until the legendary player who once strutted around in 7-inch boots was unable to control his own breathing. The culprit, doctors said, was a tiny stone buried deep inside him, devastating in its agony. The monster who had once dominated stadiums now lay helpless in a hospital bed, surrounded not by yelling fans but by fellow patients. Amidst the cold, clinical buzz of machinery and the intense surgical lighting, Gene confronted the reality that even the mightiest beings bleed. Stories fall flat when flesh becomes brittle, and he would later confess that it felt like his own body was trying to tell him something. The operation had saved him, but the scars went deeper than stitches. He was scarred for a while. For someone who had lived a life on the go, the abrupt halt was excruciating. But there were 3 people by his side, Shannon, Nick, and Sophie, who weren't just spectators. They were the rock that kept him from sinking when the waves of fame threatened to sweep him away. They sat by his side, whispered words of solace when the stillness became oppressive, and reminded him that his life on stage was just half of his story. The suffering for Gene went beyond mere physical pain. It was a face to death with mortality, a reckoning that not even a blazing bonfire could save him. The lesson came back with a vengeance in 2023, 4 years later, when Gene collapsed mid-performance in Brazil due to severe dehydration. The Titan, who had once soared above arenas, now sat trembling in a chair, forcing himself to continue as thousands watched in stunned silence. What fans had come to witness was not spectacle, but survival. Instead, they saw the frailty of a man pushing his body to its limits. At that very moment, the applause turned into a sea of prayers, a chorus of voices pleading with him to persevere. Jean then spoke with an unusual humility, saying softly, "The body reminds you that no one is forever." For a man whose entire life had been devoted to defiance, it was an admission that even the most outspoken legends would have to face silence at some point. Nevertheless, what could have been defeat transformed into something else in the embrace of his beloved. In his family, he discovered strength rather than weakness. The unwavering support of Shannon, the gentle concern of his children, and the unbreakable bond that had endured scandal after scandal were the real spotlights that shone on what truly mattered. Gene Simmons' illness did not spell the end of his legend, but rather its unveiling. Pain had peeled back the layers of armor, exposing not the demon but the man beneath. And it was in that unveiling that the greatest revelation of all time lay. Truth of all, that the true test of a life is not in how hot you burn, but in who sticks by your side when the heat fades. Gene Simmons continued to defy the march of time well into the 2020s, despite decades of touring and recent health scares that had made him face his own frailty. In 2024, when many of his contemporaries had retired, Gene began a solo tour to remind the world that his fire was far from out. He continued to perform alongside the shows, and he continued to inspire. Unveils Roadie for a Day, a daring and controversial VIP package. Fans could step behind the scenes, shadow the crew, and experience Gene's world as if they were part of his inner circle for an unbelievable price. Critics scowled, accusing him of draining the brand dry. However, tickets sold out in an instant, highlighting the contradiction. Gene Simmons, forever mocked as the ultimate salesman, yet still captivates those who desire even a fleeting moment in his spotlight. For decades, they had crossed paths, two chaotic forces on the same circuits. They had laughed backstage at festivals, traded jokes in smoke-filled dressing rooms, and even shared a late-night meal where Ozzy looked at him with that wild, unblinking stare and whispered, "Gene, the world thinks we're mad men." Then in 2025, the death of his friend Ozzy Osbourne cut through the din of business and music. Give it to them. We are forthright at least. Gene never forgot Ozzy's raw, mythic honesty, even as he became an expert at branding, licensing, and deal. Ozzy was never one to bend, pretend, or apologize for being himself. When word got out that Ozzy had gone, Gene sat quietly, not pulling out a press release or business plan. Later, Shannon recalled finding him alone in their living room. "I've never seen him so still," she remarked. The curtains drawn and the faint sound of war pigs playing on the speakers. Nick also recalled that night.